thinking. So we'll just move on with the presentation.
Yeah, good to go.
Okay, so this is just a short introduction session. I say Hans is going to talk more extensively about, in the context of one specific incarnation of the Enterprise Navigator, that is usually in the context of SAP, and both for customers at SAP and also for the SAP University Alliances program. Obviously, I'm not going to steal too much of Professor Shuren's thunder. I'm going to let him speak for himself. But I want to set the context because of what we mean by the Enterprise Navigator and how it helps us, how it frames our way of thinking. All right, so here comes the, in terms of what we'll be covering, we're starting with the 91. Folks, what's the 91?
The innovations.
It's your meta objects.
Exactly, the periodic table. So we're just going to do a quick visit of the 91, and then we're going to look at Enterprise Navigator. Do you remember what the levels 1 to 4 are? And we can go even lower than that. Couple of quick examples. This is a short session. I just want to set context, and then tying it with how we can see different views. So how we looked at it, we talked about systems, subsystems, subsystems, and so on yesterday. We also referred to enterprise architecture as well. Today, the next session is enterprise GPS and how we can see how they fit in the wider context, a combined enterprise navigator example and situation, and some very short examples. So most of this, some new, mainly revisiting what we covered yesterday. All right, so here comes the 91 meta objects that we covered yesterday from the periodic table. Why do we call it a periodic table?
Because they're the building blocks for everything that we do, and it's just like in science. And when you have the chemistry problem, as long as everybody has the same elements, we're good.
Okay, super. All right, here comes the Enterprise Navigator. Now you may remember yesterday we had levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. We also had systems, sub-subsystems, sub-subsystems, and sub-sub-subsystems, and it depends on what context that you are referring to, whether you're coming from an engineering perspective, whether you're coming from an object-oriented perspective, whether you're coming from a systems analysis or a business analysis perspective, or from an enterprise architecture perspective, and as you're going to see shortly with Professor Shuren, how we look at it from an EGPS, enterprise GPS perspective. So this again, we saw this yesterday. You also saw some examples where this was populated with values, examples, but this is the layout. So this guy that's sitting in front of you is Enterprise Navigator. So that's the structure that we use. What are we doing here? Here come the layers on the left-hand side. Here come the levels on the top. Now, because these are layers, that has meaning. Layers mean that they sit on top of one another. So the concept of a layer, we've already talked about layers. We've already talked about levels. But for better deepening our understanding, let's try and really leverage it, that we really get those concepts fixed up firmly in our minds. Layers sit on top of one another. That's why we call them layers. So anybody thinks of layers, oh, you're putting things on top of other things. We're layering them on top. So we actually use this and leverage this in this particular way. So in our Enterprise Navigator, our layers appear as rows, as vertical rows, and the column headings are the levels, and that better helps us think conceptually about what we mean by a layer and what we mean by a level. again, touching from yesterday, an example that was given in terms of here, in terms of a competition and a decomposition here. So that's just to revisit. This was one example that you saw yesterday, and there are many, many more just to do as a refresh. So we're just pulling in some of the content, in fact, all of the content that we covered yesterday. So I've used this opportunity to summarize to a large extent what we covered yesterday, at least at an overview level. So we can use Enterprise Navigator as that very context to help us pull layers and levels together. And this is an example that you saw. You can see this time we have as the level headings. Remember, levels run across the top as stereotype, type, subtype, and sub-subtype. And as you know, we can go even lower with sub-subtype, yeah, sub-sub-subtype, for example. So level 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and subsystems and so forth. So the Enterprise Navigator pulls this into one frame of reference. Just to illustrate how we might look at it, so here comes it using an enterprise architecture perspective. So now I'm in enterprise architecture. As Mark said yesterday, we have, instead of using level 1, 2, 3, 4, we use E8 terms. Mark talked about these yesterday: contextual, conceptual, logical, and physical. What that means is it gives us a frame of reference that we can articulate. Through what lens are we going to populate our layer, our levels to our layers? So that's just another view on the same thing. And here comes Professor Schuren's from Hochschule Hart, the Enterprise GPS. One thing I need to point out, because of the development of it, you can see here, this is just an example. Professor Schuren is going to speak more extensively. It's his area. He knows it in depth. But I just want to highlight in terms of how we do this. Just be aware, please be aware that this, because of the way it's been rolled out and because of the development of eGPS, you can see that the layers actually appear as rows in here, and the levels, and these are the definitions from eGPS, Enterprise GPS, these actually appear as the rows and these appear as the columns. But please remember, still think of these as layers. Think of these as sitting on top of one another. In an ideal world, we would put these guys down the left, layer, layer, layer. Here they should be: organization, department, workplace, and document. These should be the columns. All right. So just to remember, I don't want you, please make sure that you think of layers as layers and levels as levels. This is very important. It is distinct. This is the exception that, if you like, that proves the rule. But it is an exceptional way of doing it. Okay, let's just move on. What I've done here is just to put these into a very simple spreadsheet as a layout where I've given you all the views together. So here in E+, we talk about meta objects, stereotypes, and subtypes. In here, as we decompose, then obviously as we go down to level 4, then we will populate level 3, 2, and 1, and so on. That's what the required before is shown. So that helps us to capture that. But don't worry too much about that. It's meta object, stereotype, and subtype, which you've seen. Here is eGPS, which I've put these as the layers. So they therefore are, levels, therefore levels, these are therefore shown as columns. So these are levels. You can see here 1, 2, 3, and 4. So E.A. and Zachman. Zachman is the father of enterprise architecture. We at Leading Practice also work with John Zachman, and he has included invaluable input into Leading Practice from enterprise architecture. So it's great to have the father, John Zachman, as enterprise of enterprise architecture involved in leading practice as well, which is absolutely tremendous. So here, this is Zachman's contextual, conceptual, logical, and physical. And here you can see how I put these at the in the columns as the levels. And here you can see we put the levels. So it's just a way of representing it. I'm just doing this I've not populated this. It is deliberately blank because obviously these set the context depending on which discipline you're coming from. So if you're coming from an enterprise architecture, you think contextual, conceptual, logical, and physical. And if you're looking from an eGPS perspective, it's enterprise, department, workplace, and document. And from an E+ perspective, it's meta, object, stereotype, type, and subtype. I just want to ask if Mark or Jamie want to add anything to this or to comment, because it does pull in a lot of things. If Mark or Jamie would like to comment
No,
or not.
no, Simon, that's fine from my side. Great.
Okay. All right. So this is, look at it this way, and as we go back into the various views, they are laid out the way they are. Here are some examples that you've seen. But essentially, there is Enterprise Navigator. So Enterprise Navigator is the whole structure by which we can take these ways or approaches of how we, or framework more specifically, acts as our framework for how we actually relate layers and levels. All right. But this, if you fix this diagram up in your mind, then it'll help you pull in from whatever perspective. And by no means, I haven't put in this diagram, for example, systems. So systems, subsystems, subsystems, and subsystems. If you're coming from a systems analysis or a systems thinking perspective as well, I could populate this with more, obviously, columns, but there's no need to do that because I believe that you should all get the principle. So just to refresh, again, we covered this yesterday, but this is how we populate Enterprise Navigator, just with some examples here. So we've seen examples of this, how we populate it. This, I've just added these in, and this pulls on the work that George kindly did in pursuit of his research. So I've borrowed these from robotic automation and so on. But in here, how we can actually use that Enterprise Navigator structure. This is an example that just sits on the business layer, obviously. Purpose and goal and value as a sub-layer. Object number, meta object name. We've added a description here for convenience, so we can tailor the navigator structure that's fit for purpose if we want to articulate it. Here, remember, as Ulrich showed you yesterday in E+, you could also see the descriptions of what each meta object, remember, class type level 1 we're referring to. And as we go down into level 2, here we call stereotype and so on, and level 3 type, we don't go to 4, but just for the size of the slide. But you can see here we can actually add in description. So we can tailor this, and this is all, what you see in front of you here, we can capture in E+ as well. So we can add this further detail. Indeed, both Ulrich and Mark yesterday described how you can even upload documents to E+ as well, and that was the most excellent feature that we can do that. So that's just taking that concept of how we can create descriptive content that is aligned to the relevant layer, the relevant sub-layer, the relevant class type, and the relevant level. So this provides the structure by which we can articulate our way of thinking. That way of thinking, therefore, enables our way of working, because the way of thinking sets the context, by which we go through the way of working. So we work from this structure, and then, as you'll see later when we come on to describe something called artifacts, then you'll see how we take that through into the way of modeling. So the way it works is this. We look at Enterprise Navigator, layers, levels, objects. Also, don't forget semantic relations. And then from that sets our way of thinking. And then our way of thinking leads to our way of working, because this is how we want to work. So we're not going off and making a huge mess by just going in directions. So the way of thinking, this way of thinking, sets our way of working, and therefore sets our way of modeling. So these are just a couple of examples that you can see. You've got access to the slides from the Dropbox link, and here's just an example. So these are just a couple of examples that you can see in here. So this one here is an SAP example, and that sort of just slightly that lends itself to what Professor Shaw and Hans Schoren will be describing when it comes to enterprise GPS. But the way we've done this is just to show you using the layered being the rows, the levels being the columns, which you see as described in here. So that hopefully sets a little bit of comparative context. So that's it, folks. So short, just going through that. I just wanted to set the scene. You can see that Enterprise Navigator is one of the pivots in leading practice, and it provides a most convenient framework by which we can articulate our way of thinking, leading to our way of working, leading to our way of modeling. So that's it, folks. So thank you very much for listening. So let's open it up to brief discussion.